Welcome to the Season 3 of Pathfinder Spot, conversations with entrepreneurs on systems change and leadership across the world. My name is Yolana, and today we will be discussing AI ethics and whether AI can be a much needed force to reach a more sustainable world. I'm introducing you to Fran Baker.
Fran is a League Fellow since 2022. She's an independent researcher who recently completed the inaugural Masters in AI Ethics and Society at the University of Cambridge. She was selected as the United Nations Global Compact SDG Pioneer for the UK in 2020, and since 2021, she has been part of the Tiny ML Foundation for Good Working Group. Fran is Director of Sustainability and Social Impact at ARM, a UK headquartered semiconductor design company. And in her work, she focuses on extending the benefit of technology to people and areas yet to benefit, championing impact and values-driven leadership in business. Today, we will be hearing about her academic research in AI ethics and her thesis on the sustainability of AI, exploring the role of sacrifice zones in the production, usage, and disposal of AI infrastructure. Fran is sharing her research with us today in her personal capacity, not as a representative of any institution. So Fran, thank you so much for agreeing to share your research with us. I'm so interested in learning from you today, and a huge welcome from us all.
Thank you very much. And it's really nice to see so many familiar, friendly faces looking back at me on this screen as well. So thank you all for joining. For any conversation about AI or AI ethics, it's worth determining what we mean. So AI can be understood differently depending on your perspective or your standpoint. And it can be described as a tool or an idea, a field or a technology. And this will totally depend on who you're talking to and in what context. And so with Yolana's caveat, I share in this discussion from my own standpoint, my own experience, and not representing the views of any organization I may be affiliated with. It's impossible to cover this topic in its entirety, and definitely not in a short presentation, but I've tried my best to show a top-line range of key topics in ethical AI that you may want to hear about, just to set the scene, and then move on to sharing my own research. So forgive any oversights in advance. AI is often broadly described as the ability of machines to perform tasks that are commonly associated with intelligent beings, human intelligence. AI as an immensely broad term and AI as a field incorporates many different subdomains. So for example, natural language processing or NLP, computer vision, for example, image recognition, speech, robotics, machine learning, which is a method to train a computer to learn from inputs, but without explicit programming for all circumstances. But this description is incomplete and inadequate because no technology exists in a vacuum. And this type of description doesn't always consider invisible material or human contributions that enable AI infrastructure today. And so ambitions for digitalization to dematerialize our economies can create additional challenges, which we'll come to shortly. But first, as there's no one-size-fits-all description of AI, in part due to that variety in meanings and applications and dependency on context, I share 3 quotes here to touch on that. The first from Alan Turing, highly influential in the development of theoretical computer science, who said, quote, "A computer would deserve to be called intelligent if it could deceive a human into believing that it was human," in reference to the Turing machine, an abstract computer that encapsulates the fundamental logical principles of a digital computer. And some people argue that Turing was the first person to bring respectability to the idea that machines might one day think. And for context, Turing was born in 1912 and died in 1954. The second quote from Marvin Minsky, mathematician, cognitive and computer scientist, who was concerned mainly with research of AI and one of the most famous AI practitioners, who said, quote, artificial intelligence is the science of making machines do things that would require intelligence if done by men, end quote. And for context, Minsky was born in 1927 and died in 2016. Now, there is a lot more to say around these two quotes. One consideration is around the hidden women in computer science history, for example, or the Western-centric quotes that I've shown here. But for the purpose of this presentation, these two quotes go to show that the emergence of AI that we think that we're seeing now is actually not new, and that looking to the past can help us to see these different streams that have led towards today. And then my final quote for today from Kate Crawford, which is, quote, "AI is neither artificial nor intelligent." And for context, Kate Crawford was born in 1976. She's an academic, a principal researcher at Microsoft Research, co-founder of AI Now Institute, amongst other accolades. But I think that this quote is really interesting because it doesn't really line up with the types of things that we're hearing about in some conversations around AI. It's at odds with the hype that we sometimes hear today about artificial intelligence. And the kinds of tropes that express human hopes and fears of AI, which academics Stephen Cave and Kanta Dehal have described in their work. It's these sorts of narratives of AI that are perpetuated by the images that we see and the stories that we hear. The perception of AI being a savior for our social and environmental challenges, or sometimes, and frankly, sometimes more prominently, the science fiction dystopian future narratives. These types of images contribute to collective understandings of AI. The small, white, plastic, cute humanoid robot with large eyes, the robot hand reaching out towards the human hand, the hypersexualized AI, human shape, exposed breasts, and the concerns of AI becoming more intelligent than humans, portrayed in the types of images of half human, half robot, sentient beings. These are all design choices. The representation of AI is a choice, a human choice. And there are people working to improve the way that AI is talked about, shown, and represented to the general public. So Better Images of AI, a not-for-profit group, argue that these types of sci-fi futuristic images actually hinder the understanding of AI and its already significant societal and environmental impacts, as well as overclaiming AI's capabilities. So quite often, these images and narratives are referenced in describing artificial general intelligence, AGI, where machines attain human-level intelligence or beyond. And so Better Images of AI have created a repository of, you've guessed it, better images of AI that anyone can use under Creative Commons to more accurately reflect the capabilities of technology, in that it's generally applied to a specific task, it's not of human-level intelligence, and it does not have emotions. It's also to represent the social and environmental impacts of AI systems and to better reflect the complex and wide-reaching nature of AI as a socio-technical system. What is a socio-technical system, I hear you cry? Well, when I described the diagram earlier as being incomplete, what I mean is that technologies, including AI, aren't created and don't exist in a vacuum. AI is a complex, messy thing. It's a socio-technical system in that there's a combination of the technical aspect, the code, the data, and the social aspects, the people, the politics, the power that surround them. And there have been many different contributions to the field of AI. Another myth around technology is that it exists on its own, a painstaking invention from one individual built on top of another, when in reality, it's a range of fields from computer programming, cognitive science and psychology, linguistics, and so on, and societal changes that bring about what we think of as AI, as the social and the technical interweave. And so back to Better Images of AI and a few examples here. Bounding boxes are commonly used in AI research to signify where a computer vision algorithm has detected an object in an image. And in the top left-hand corner there, you can see an image from Max Gruber, who has 3D printed frames representing those bounding boxes and placed them around objects in a physical environment, a banana, a flask, a plant. In the top right-hand side, you can see a silicon monocrystal, which is a crucial component for AI manufacture. And the photographer, Catherine Breslin, knows about this firsthand in her work as a machine learning voice engineer and consultant, and had previously been involved with building the Amazon Alexa. In the bottom left corner, you can see data annotation. This picture is trying to show data annotation, which is becoming a professional field of its own. And there can be different specializations, for example, video labeling or medical image labeling, to name a few. The idea of this image being to bring what's often referred to as ghost work out of the shadows. And then finally, in the bottom right-hand corner, the GPU, graphics processing unit, which is a chip that's used in mobiles, computers, cloud computing infrastructure, and so on, and can also be used for other computation, such as training neural networks. And so in reality, many conversations that are happening around AI that exist today are about narrow AI. Autonomous vehicles, recommender systems, chatbots, predictive maintenance, image and speech recognition. These are all examples of narrow AI and not the super intelligence that I alluded to earlier. And that is not to say in any way that these technologies are not very impressive. Generative AI has gained a lot of traction this year, but even computer programs like ChatGPT, which is a language model designed to understand and generate human-like text based on the input it receives, is limited by the data it was trained on. So in that respect, there's concerns around, say, the diversity of that data, but even more simply, ChatGPT's training data includes information only up until a certain date, for example. And so with that very fast context setting, I want to then move on to how we converge around ethics and responsibility of AI, a global, far-reaching, impactful technology that is multifaceted. And I like this data visualization on principled artificial intelligence, a map of ethical and rights-based approaches to principles for AI and the body of work that accompanies it. And this stems from many organizations and governments producing or endorsing principles. And a team of researchers at the Berkman Klein Center, led by Jessica Fjeld, set out to map these and see if there was any convergence or divergence around particular topics or themes, as well as providing an easier way to view those themes that were consistently deemed to be important. And they were looking for a diverse data set across different stakeholders in different geographies to lead to 8 key themes, which I've zoomed in on here, which focus on privacy, accountability, safety and security, transparency and explainability, fairness and non-discrimination, human control of technology, professional responsibility, and the promotion of human values, all centered around international human rights. And now this work is from 2020 and a lot has happened since then, though I think it remains a useful data visualization on that convergence of themes in ethical and rights-based approaches to AI from across government, the private sector, civil society, and so on. It does not answer the question of how do you translate principles into practice, which is a whole other topic, but it does show that trend. Now, to touch on a bit more detail on some active areas of research, AI safety tends to focus around non-harm and value alignment. So this can relate to superintelligence and ensuring that AI systems have goals and values that are aligned with human values and objectives, but also ensuring that AI systems don't make unintended or harmful decisions that can be related to ethical dilemmas or adversarial attacks or misclassifications, for example. In the privacy space, there's a lot of work in this space around surveillance, consent, control. So, for example, facial recognition systems being used to track and monitor individuals. And Carissa Veliz's Privacy is Power is a great book to have a look at if you're interested in this area. And that facial recognition example can also be extended to the challenge of bias. So where AI systems used in this context have been found to perform less accurately on individuals with darker skin tones, particularly women. You can look at Joy Bullingweeni's work for more information on that. And these things matter because there's real world implications attached to these systems. So, for example, in that context, facial recognition, that could lead to misidentification by law enforcement, as just one example. When we get to explainability, for example, in deep learning models such as deep neural networks, these models are highly complex and can be very difficult to interpret and explain in terms of decision-making processes. So, for example, a deep learning deep neural network trained to diagnose medical conditions based on patient data, that could be images or electronic health records, say it achieves high accuracy, but healthcare professionals and even AI developers don't understand why the model's making a diagnosis, the lack of explainability makes it a challenge to explain why it's reached a specific diagnosis. And that's essential to know when a patient's health is at stake. So this can also lead to issues of trust or hinder regulatory approval and so on. And then with regards to human-machine relationships, a lot of conversations in this space are focused right now around the future of work, on economic impacts or workplace rights. And as automation technologies and AI advance, some people are concerned about the displacement of human workers. So we can see that in relation to manufacturing or repetitive tasks, but also the screenwriter strike recently has shown how AI has the potential to impact workforces in different ways. And lastly, the piece that I'm going to talk more about today is sustainability. So Struble, Ganesh and McCallum have claimed that a single deep learning NLP, natural language processing model, can generate approximately 600,000 pounds of carbon dioxide emissions, for example. This has also been discussed in relation to generative AI and large language models, LLMs, in that they are more energy intensive than perhaps other methods of retrieving answers to questions. However, sustainability goes beyond energy. Amy Van Winsberg coined the term sustainable AI, which is a movement towards entire lifecycle considerations of AI products and with greater focus on concerns of ecological and social justice. And I think it's important to note that Van Winsberg distinguishes between two differing concerns: AI for sustainability and the sustainability of AI. The former, AI for sustainability, represents the use of AI systems towards sustainability goals. So, for example, use in climate modeling or conservation monitoring. And the latter focuses on the sustainability of AI itself. So, for example, energy and water consumption of AI models, raw materials required to build physical infrastructure. But I think this is really interesting because notions of responsibility in AI are also beginning to extend to the environment, and considerations of sustainability are becoming included in conversations around ethical AI. And one area that receives far less attention around the sustainability of AI is what occurs before and after an AI tool is used. That includes the physical inputs, the minerals, water, and so on, required to build and run AI infrastructure, and then what happens to that infrastructure at the end of its lifespan. And I see this as connecting to a broader phenomenon of a growing disconnection between virtual worlds and their cost to the physical world. And that varies by location and by geography in terms of how far you can separate yourself from that reality. And so in my thesis, I broadly interrogated the relationship between AI and the environment and questioned the notion that current and future AI innovations will solve the ecological and societal crises humanity is facing by instead looking at the limitations and impacts of existing AI infrastructure from production to disposal. And at this point, it's worth explaining a few of the key terms that I'll use through the rest of the presentation. So what do I mean by AI infrastructure? We often think of AI as this ethereal, entirely virtual thing, or at least I did before I dug a bit deeper into it, and not of its physical infrastructure. So AI and AI infrastructure is not only data, algorithms, models in the virtual world, but also material contingencies and human infrastructure in the physical world, the component parts and places and people and processes that enable AI systems to work, that constitute this broader social and relational, you guessed it, socio-technical system. And I applied an environmental justice lens to AI infrastructure using a cumulative end-to-end set of examples, and went on a journey through a symbolic life cycle of an AI, moving from the initial extraction of raw materials to a specific application of an IoT tool to e-waste management. And environmental justice is intertwined with the principles of sustainability and environmentalism, and I know many people on this call will be familiar with this. However, environmental justice is exploring inequalities that undermine sustainability. So where environmentalism predominantly considers the sustainability of natural resources in the longer term, environmental justice is prioritizing the impacts and needs of people right now. Environmental justice scholars being concerned with the fair and equitable distribution of both environmental benefits and burdens. And since the negative impacts of climate crises disproportionately impact people of colour, it is interlinked with environmental racism. And the term sacrifice zones is a key conceptual framework within environmental justice that's evolved and adapted over time. So an infamous example of a sacrifice zone was in Warren County, New Jersey, in the USA in 1982, where contaminated soil containing polychlorinated biphenyl, PCB, which is a highly carcinogenic chemical compound, was buried in a landfill in a majority Black community. And so sacrifice zones combine considerations from geography, ecology, economics, and sustainability and their subdomains in, I think, helpful and boundaried ways. And the common thread is that they predominantly focus on a location and refer to the situating of toxic land uses in economically poor or racially minoritized populations. And so in my work, I applied this concept to digitalization and AI to understand whether locations and communities suffer from their proximity to toxicity in relation to AI. And looking back, I can see the inspiration to start this research and consider sustainability and impact alongside AI had been coming for some years. So I work in sustainability and social impact, and in my job, I consider the environmental and social implications of technology with the goal of maximizing positive impact. And alongside that, I was becoming more and more interested in technologies, particularly AI, and what they're made up of, what the physical components are that make up and contribute to our virtual worlds. And so my interest was really piqued when I saw this very complicated visual, which you can view online at anatomy.of.ai by Kate Crawford and Vlad Anjola, which is an anatomical map of human labor, data, and planetary resources for the Amazon echo. And I was fortunate to see this for the first time in all its glory on an enormous wall in an art gallery in 2018 or 2019. And being able to see every aspect of the vast systems and networks that underpin a single AI device, batteries, data centers, salaries of workers, and so on, I was deeply inspired. And it left me with open questions. Does the future of AI align with what we know from a sustainability perspective? And with greater connectivity, more data being generated, how do we fully appreciate, measure, and understand the true cost of technologies on the planet across their life cycle? And also, what do we do with all this stuff? And so I wanted to investigate whether the computational and processing needs of society are currently at odds with the ecological constraints of the planet. And to do so, I broke my research down into 3 parts. I explored 3 stages in the life cycle or symbolic life cycle of AI infrastructure via a focus on particular areas within those stages of production, use, and disposal, and to look at the acceptable losses associated with silicon chip production, IoT device use, and e-waste disposal. So following that birth, life, death analogy. And the examples I surveyed were a sand mining site for high purity silica necessary for silicon chip production from an environmental perspective, conservation monitoring as an example of an IoT device in use from a social perspective, and an informal e-waste processing site considering digital infrastructure disposal from an economic perspective. And from this survey, I concluded that planetary dependencies of AI growth don't adequately account for the hardwired biophysical limits necessary for life on Earth to flourish. And that AI requires more ecological and societal affordances than advocates are presently accounting for. And this isn't to say that AI can't contribute solutions to pressing challenges. We've already seen value, for example, in climate modeling. However, I argue that these sites that I give as examples can be viewed as sacrifice zones associated with AI, in that there are gaps that need to be addressed between AI's requirements and its role in addressing climate or justice concerns. So to take each section in turn and look briefly in a bit more detail, I looked at sand mining in 2 locations to highlight misconceptions related to sand mining for digital infrastructure. Those misconceptions being 1, that abundance is equal to infinite supply, and 2, that temporary mining activity equals temporary impact. And this is because AI's origin story begins with minerals extracted from the earth. Raw materials and elements are commonly mined or taken from the earth for use in compute infrastructure, as well as for many other things that enable 21st century life. But since the 1950s, silicon has been the dominant substrate of choice for making semiconductor chips, and silicon comes from processed sand. And you might look around and think, well, there's sand all over the world. There's vast deserts of sand. However, sand is an abundant, yet finite, natural resource. Naturally occurring sand of any type or grade is non-renewable in human timescales, according to Kieran Pereira. And as quartz and sand are produced in geological time, for example, thousands or millions of years, that's problematic. And sand is not yet recognized as a non-renewable resource due to its abundance and a lack of awareness of both its technological uses and the ecosystem services it provides. In addition, ubiquity does not equal utility. Say that again. Ubiquity does not equal utility. So only very high purity sand can be used for high-tech purposes, and that is 99% purity and above. So sand is categorized based on its properties, and for the computing industry, the most important categorization is purity. Silicon-based chip manufacturing is an extremely impressive, expensive, and energy-intensive process. And many industrial accounts list a practice known as deposition as step 1. So deposition describes a process where a silicon ingot, which is a 1 to 2 meter cylindrical lump of silicon, has been sliced into wafers on which thin films of materials are deposited to enable integrated circuits to be printed and cut. These are then deployed for compute purposes. And chips are so called because they're microscopic pieces of semiconductor material chipped out of an ingot, which you can see on the screen before you. However, you will not find a silicon ingot in nature. Electronic grade silicon can only have 1 impurity atom for every 1 billion silicon atoms. And so before this crucial stage, raw materials are mined from the earth. So back to sand. Industrial sand, or silica sand, is of a much higher purity than the sand that we use for construction or land reclamation, and it's found only in specific locations with high purity silica deposits. For my survey, I focused on 1 site in the USA and 1 site in Canada, and those sites came about through continental plate boundaries colliding millions of years ago. So high purity, naturally occurring deposits of sand are scarce. And what I looked at was whether these locations and the communities that live in them benefited from being at the heart of high-tech production. And what I found was that actually the communities near these sites didn't benefit from the wealth generated from the mines. They earned less, their connectivity was poorer than average, and they were exposed to toxicity of mining through their proximity to the sites. And of course, mining activities such as sand mining are a one-way process. There are significant purification and refinement methods which have an effect at the local level on the local environment. For example, acid leaching, which is a practice that leaves areas unusable in the future. And in this section, I argue that the lack of awareness regarding sand's importance as a natural resource prevents progress on improving practices when compared to, say, oil and gas extraction. And this is not to say that there's no one researching this or understanding this significance. Critical raw materials is a term used by governments to denote strategic economic importance and supply risk. Critical raw materials are produced in small quantities or have special characteristics that make them uniquely valuable. And silicon metal as an essential ingredient to semiconductor chips, but also to photovoltaics and other uses, has been on the European Union's critical raw material list since 2017, for example. Though for this research, my focus was on the particular sites and how the people and ecology around sand mining sites suffer health and economic consequences, and view these as being considered acceptable losses in AI infrastructure. And therefore, considerations for the materials required for both technology and sustainability agendas should be considered side by side. And there's a lot more that I can say about this topic. I have a newfound obsession with sand. Some people on this call may be familiar with that obsession because I talk about it a lot. But in the interest of time and given the range of topics, I'll move to part 2 of 3. So I followed this symbolic life cycle into device use to assess the societal implications of an IoT device in use. And the example that I used here was conservation monitoring technologies. So with growing abundance and use of AI and IoT, that's Internet of Things, even traditionally off-grid locations have the ability to be surveilled or monitored. And these tools are often called upon in pursuit of biodiversity and conservation practices. And what I was considering in this aspect of my research was a focus on cultural and epistemological losses, that is, ways of knowing, and how they can be erased or subject to power imbalances through the use of conservation monitoring technologies. And in this way, I really hoped to kind of illuminate some of the tensions and trade-offs that are embedded in IoT device use that aren't immediately recognized as problematic in the context of AI for good. And now, CMTs are primarily used to monitor wildlife populations, and advances in devices and imagery and data, for example, drones or satellites or remote sensing, have increased digital capability in conservation. And these improvements have enabled advances in data collection, analysis, and inference, and have really supported the conservation sector to move beyond traditional ground and paper-based surveying methods. And the tools are used for many different purposes, for example, to prevent poaching or monitor the health and location of species or improve caretaking for rangers who often have to cover vast areas in the goals of conservation. And the types of tools could be things like radio collars or camera traps that are triggered by activity, or acoustic sensors that are activated, for example, by a gunshot. And the pictures that I'm showing here are of the top left corner is conservationists looking at their devices. The top right corner is mapping iguanas from above in the Galapagos. The bottom right is a curious deer that I think has activated a camera trap. And the bottom left corner is me having an emotional moment with a rhino just because. And this increased capability also comes with additional challenges around privacy. And so a growing community of practitioners are now considering the ethics of AI for conservation and for conservation monitoring technologies. So notable work there is from Adams, Pritchard, and also Sandbrook and their co-authors, who've developed principles for the socially responsible use of conservation monitoring technologies, which is a really interesting piece of work. And whether devices such as camera traps or acoustic sensors are mechanical or automated in functionality, there are privacy concerns in that their discrete nature means that they are difficult to spot or can be difficult to spot. So, for example, in the Corvette Tiger Reserve in Uttarakhand in India, state-owned camera traps are used for tiger preservation and also for the prevention of attacks on the local community. And groups of women using the forest to collect firewood have been found to modify their behaviours, for example, reducing conversations to avoid private conversations from being captured. You can read more about this and many other examples in Trishant Simlai's work. And another example is related in this context to wildlife crime. So, for example, hunting bushmeat for sustenance and trade is a common practice across the tropics. And you can imagine here how conflicting goals can have detrimental effects on some communities. So, for example, conservation practitioners, in that context, species conservation might be the primary goal, whereas for the local community where that tool's been embedded, this might conflict with the need to eat or supplement their livelihoods. And so therefore, I'm arguing that conservation monitoring technologies for species conservation represent a really acute example of priorities and values being codified in algorithms, models, and data. And so I argue that these tools can embed and prioritize certain epistemologies or ways of knowing about the natural world at the expense of others. In addition, the digital infrastructure of connected devices for conservation monitoring replicates social infrastructures and power imbalances. So conservation itself as a field is a hotly contested issue. Alongside the very real need to preserve biodiversity and remain within planetary boundaries, some scholars argue that conservation is a process that extends neoliberalist capitalist ideologies into conservation areas and simply harnesses the value of resources in situ, so say Fletcher, Dressler, and Boucher. But these all have underlying narratives around extractivism and coloniality, which are systemic challenges. So what I discuss in this part of my work is that values computationally encoded into conservation monitoring technologies can treat Western scientific epistemologies as superior to traditional place-based wisdoms. And that's significant when we consider that WWF and others state that Indigenous people are responsible for 80% of the world's biodiversity and have proved essential to maintaining life on Earth for millennia, yet represent only 5% of the world's population. And though not monolithic, Indigenous people are recognised as the best land managers in the world by Garnet and others. And although efforts are underway to put Indigenous knowledge at the heart of conservation decision-making, it can be problematic that Western scientific thought in conservation does have widespread influence over other knowledge systems. And this, I think, is because complex challenges require multiple ways of knowing. Who owns, controls, and programs AI systems is crucially important to outcomes in conservation and in other spaces. So, moving on to part 3 of 3. Following on the symbolic life cycle to the disposal phase raises difficult questions, actually, about who or what must bear the burden of our digital dependencies. So in 2023, e-waste is the fastest growing waste stream in the world. And very little has been written about AI disposal, though at end of life, AI enabling hardware and IoT devices will transition to waste product, and that's due to difficulties in disposal, their inorganic nature, security and privacy considerations, as well as social norms and behaviors. And so in this section of my work, I argued that it's necessary to continue to consider the environment, social and economic impact of AI beyond its useful life, which is, I think, a stage often unaccounted for in its production and use. Now, device obsolescence varies between being planned, which is an intentional manufacturing philosophy, or dynamic, which is around consumer desire for greater ease or greater status. And the abundance of waste from digital technologies is a relatively modern phenomenon. So in 2009, the number of IoT devices surpassed the number of people globally for the first time in history, which I think represents a critical failure in digitalization and sustainability agendas, in that we're continuing to produce more than can be processed. there are these technical, economic, and social blockers to circularity or other agendas that mean that this waste that you can see now is inorganic, it's toxic, and it's stacking up. So e-waste is expected to grow exponentially and estimated to reach 75 million metric tons by 2030 or 110 million metric tons by 2050 if left unchecked. And the current waste systems associated with IT aren't fit for purpose in an unsustainable and rapidly digitizing world. And that's because the changing nature of waste and waste processing aren't changing at the same pace. So in 2019, the fate of nearly, I think it's 83% of e-waste globally was uncertain. And whilst these disposal strategies are a bit murky, it's very clear that transboundary waste movements are an integral part of e-waste disposal. E-waste is often dumped or sold around the world, often in different locations to its production and use, and predominantly concludes its journey in lower resource settings where labour's cheaper and import laws are looser. And this leads to sacrifice zones in the form of digital graveyards, is what I've shared in my work, which have significant environmental, economic, and social impacts on those who live near them. And due to this combination of socio-economic factors, we're collectively dumping e-waste far beyond the assimilative capacity of the ecosphere. And so while evidence shows that access to AI-enabling devices and connectivity predominantly benefits individuals in high-income countries, according to the GSMA, the majority of discarded electrical and electronic equipment disassembly and disposals is outsourced to low to middle-income countries, often in locations without the resources or infrastructure to appropriately address their toxicity. And the location that I looked at for this survey was Agbogbloshie in Ghana, which has been recognised historically as one of the most significant e-waste dumps in the world by the Environmental Justice Atlas, and as one of the most contaminated places on Earth. And the reason I chose Agbogbloshie was because it was prominently featured for some years in Western media outlets as emblematic of Western consumption and unequal transboundary waste. However, Ghanaian British visual sociologist Heather Agyapong argued that this is only a Western gaze on a place that's in fact a functioning, profit-making recycling network. So here we have different perspectives on what this is. And despite the occupational hazards of e-waste work, this area enabled economic opportunity in exchange for exposure to health risks. But I think sites like this show how humans as well as e-waste are discarded. So renowned philosopher Achille Mbembe recognized humans as waste in their work Necropolitics and understood that as a form of devaluation of how some people live and die. And whilst e-waste processing provides economic opportunities, I think this should be possible without toxic and detrimental effects to workers' health. And so this also draws parallels with outsourced virtual tasks related to, say, commercial content moderation and data classification, where workers watch abusive, offensive materials to prevent others from having to do so, which has significant mental health impacts. And so in July 21, the Ghanaian government demolished the site at Agbogbloshie, which is in Greater Accra. And all of this is to say that device afterlife and the disposal of AI infrastructure at the end of life is not straightforward. The location that I have in mind here with Agbogbloshie was the heart of a resource recovery industry in the area and a livelihood source for thousands of the city's residents. And so there's these continuous trade-offs that exist between the growth-oriented goals of the tech sector and economies more broadly, and the environmental and social well-being for those involved in its dismantlement. And so as such, the expectation that digital technologies can solve sustainability challenges, I think it's failing to account for the impact of those technologies today, as AI infrastructure will likely be built on top of existing digital infrastructure. So to conclude, looking to AI as a solution for sustainability challenges in the future can mean that harms are overlooked today. Ambitions for digitalization to dematerialize our economies can create additional challenges. And AI infrastructure built on top of unsustainable and inequitable practices of digital infrastructure compounds challenges. So I think considering the invisible material and human contributions that enable AI infrastructure today is necessary. On the upside, AI technologies can and do enable AI for sustainability. So, for example, thinking about how AI can contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals, though not perfect, they're a great example of international cooperation around really bold ambitions. And I've shared my thoughts on how considering technologies purely through their technicality is reductive, how harms can still be created even in noble cases, and how there's no single clean-cut solution to complex socio-technical challenges. And that's because I chose an intentionally critical lens with which to pursue my research. However, I'm an optimist, and what I've learned through my time researching and through my degree is that there's a huge amount of incredibly intelligent people thinking about and looking at these types of challenges. So in addition, key contributions to climate modelling, for example, without planetary scale computation, it would be near impossible to understand the vast swathes of data that collectively explain our world. So what I'm interested in is how we can consider the possibilities of artificial intelligence for the future whilst benefiting the rights of people today. And with that, I will draw to a close. So thank you all for your time.
I'd like to extend a big thank you to Fran for joining us and sharing her master's research. If you enjoyed today's episode and would like to explore more, you can find us at Pathfinder Spot on Apple Music and Spotify. Give us a follow and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for listening, and until next time, take care of yourself and take care of each other.